Hello students, welcome to session 5 of reproduction in plants. We'll continue the topic of sexual reproduction in today's session also. In the last session we studied about sexual reproduction, in which we discussed about male and female organs in a complete flower, and we studied about the structure of a flower. So the main parts of a flower, including the reproductive parts of the plant, are sepals, petals, stamen and pistil. So these are all the main parts of a flower, right? So now in today's session we will see that what is meant by pollination, how does it occurs, and after that we will study about fertilization. But first let us see that what is pollination. Yes students, pollination is the first step in the process of seed formation. So remember, this is the very important point. Pollination is the first step in the process of seed formation. Now here the male gamete present in the pollen grains of the anthers need to reach the female gamete in the ovary, which is present in the pistil. Only then fertilization takes place. So for the male gametes to be able to combine with the female gamete, it is necessary that first the pollen grains from the anther of stamen should be carried to the stigma of pistil. And when this transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a stamen to the stigma of a pistil occurs, then it is termed as pollination, or we can say that pollination has taken place. So pollination is said to take place when pollen grains are carried from the anther to the stigma of the flower. Remember this students, that we can say that pollination has occurred only when the pollen grains are carried from anther to stigma of a flower, right? So pollination is basically done by many agents, which we will study, which is our next topic, the agents of pollination. So pollination basically occurs by insects like bees and butterflies, birds, wind and water. So pollination can occur in two ways: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Let us first see that what is the definition of pollination. Yes, the transfer of the pollen grains to the stigma of the flower or stigma of the pistil in a flower is known as pollination. And pollination is of two types: self-pollination and cross-pollination. So when the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, let us see. First let us see this beautiful diagram. Let us understand the meaning of this. Yes, here you can see the arrow, the two arrows. This is termed as self-pollination. This is also self-pollination. I'll explain you why this is termed as self-pollination and this is cross-pollination. What is the difference between the two? Now you see that when the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, this is the same flower, or if it occurs on another flower of the same plant, if the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the same flower, this is the same flower, this is occurring in the same flower, or if it occurs on another flower on the same plant, then it is termed as self-pollination. Right? So is it clear to you? So when the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant, it is called self-pollination. Whereas when the pollen grains from the anther of a flower, this is the anther, assume that this is the anther of a flower. So when the pollen grains from the anther of a flower on one plant are transferred to the stigma of another flower on another similar plant, it is called cross-pollination. So how does this pollination occurs? Insects help in cross-pollination. Wind helps in cross-pollination. Water helps in cross-pollination. As well as on the same flower, self pollination occurs, and it is more easier than the mechanism of or the process of cross pollination. So students, there are some ways by which this pollination occurs. But before going to the topic of agents of pollination, let us again study clearly the self-pollination and cross-pollination. Yes, students, in self-pollination, pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the same flower as we discussed. So here you can see a beautiful diagram which is showing the self-pollination. The self-pollination where anther of the stamen is transferred to the stigma of the pistil of the same flower, right? So here this is stigma which receives the pollen from the anthers, because anthers produce pollen grains which contains male gametes, and as we know that pollination occurs when both the sexes are there, right? So male gametes and female gametes are present in the same flower, right? So here what will happen, that when self-pollination occurs, when anthers are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, here ovules will play a very important role in producing the female gametes, right? So these male gametes and female gametes both are helpful in making this pollination occur very easily. So in this way pollination occurs in flower. Other than this self-pollination, there is cross-pollination. So in cross-pollination, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, even if it is of same kind. Same kind means same plant. So pollination takes place with the help of external agents such as wind, water, and insects, and they are all called the agents of pollination. Right? So our next interesting topic is agents of pollination. So let us study about it. Here students, agent of pollination, agents of pollination. Students, as we studied that in pollination, that pollination is the process through which the female parts of a plant are fertilized by male parts of another plant. So the filament and anther structures that make up the male parts of a plant produce the pollen that acts as a fertilizer material. So the female parts, that is stigma, style and ovary, they house the eggs that will be pollinated once pollen comes into contact with them. And both insects and wind currents and other agents take part in this pollination process. So insects also act as the agent of pollination, and they are attracted to colorful flowers and their nectars, and they carry around pollen particles as they move from plant to plant. Even wind currents work to blow pollen particles from plant to plant. You will be very amazed to know about the conifers. So students, what happens in conifers? Yes, conifers are the plants that carry their reproductive parts on the scales of their cones according to encyclopedia. So students, shrubs and trees make up most of this species, where the male sex cells, they reside in pollen particles that form inside small male cones, and the female sex cells are contained inside the eggs that sit on the female ones, the female cones. So wind currents work to blow pollen particles into the air, and many of which fall to the ground. And the ones that don't fall to the ground find their way to the female cones of other plants and begin the reproductive procedure or reproductive process from there. You see how this pollination occurs so amazingly in conifers. So we will see such more examples of pollination. So students, the agents of pollination, the most common agents of pollination are wind, water and insects. Students, wind blows away pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So basically, such flowers are small. Like here you can see a beautiful picture of a wheat plant. So pollination by wind occurs in wheat as well as in other plants too. So students, such flowers in which the pollination by wind occurs are very small. They are not brightly colored and they do not produce nectar, which is a sweet liquid produced by flowers, by which the insects get attracted. So these flowers by which the pollination by wind occurs do not produce nectar. Pollen grains are very light in these types of flowers, and so they are easily blown away by the wind. So here male and female gametes are exposed to the wind, and some examples are wheat, rice and maize. Okay, these are some of the examples. So basically pollination occurs in several ways. Even people can transfer pollen from one flower to another. But most plants are pollinated without any help of people. Usually plants rely on animals, or means the pollination of plants, this process rely on animals or the wind to pollinate them. Right? So students, it occurs by wind, it occurs by water, and it also occurs by insects. Students, pollination by water means pollination in aquatic plants such as seagrass and Vallisneria is usually carried out by water. So this is the beautiful picture of Vallisneria. This is the Vallisneria plant in which pollination occurs by water. So here, water pollinated flowers release their pollen grains into the water, and then they are slowly carried to other flowers by water currents. So students, in this way, pollination by water occurs. Other than this, there is one more agent of pollination, and it is by insects. So students, many insects visit flowers for nectar, and during the process some pollen sticks to the body parts of these insects, and when these insects visit another flower, the pollen grains fall on the stigma, and in this way the fertilization process starts. So students, here you can see the beautiful picture of a bee which has visited a flower, and during this process pollen sticks to the body parts of these insects, and when these insects visit another flower, the pollen grains fall on the stigma. So you see students that when animals such as bees, butterflies, moths, flies and hummingbirds pollinate plants, it's accidental. It's not intentional. They are not trying to pollinate the plant, and they don't even know that they are actually pollinating the plant. Usually they are at the plant to get food, and the sticky pollen or a sweet nectar made at the base of the petals. So when feeding, the animals accidentally rub against the stamens and get the pollen stuck all over themselves. And when they move to another flower to feed, some of the pollen can rub off onto this new plant stigma. So plants that are pollinated by such insects or animals often are brightly colored, and they have a strong smell to attract the animal pollinators. So students, in this way the pollination occurs by insects. The insect pollinated flowers usually have sweet smell. They are brightly colored petals. They have brightly colored petals, and they are rich in nectar. So such flowers are the flowers of sweet pea plant or orchids, etc. So flowers even visited by nocturnal insects means the insects which are active during night, not the daytime. They have less showy petals but are often strongly scented. For example, jasmine. That is why it is called Raat Ki Rani, popularly called Raat Ki Rani. Right? So basically these are the agents of pollination. So as far we have studied about pollination, but did you ever give a thought that why this pollination occurs and why is it important? Basically students, pollination is very important because it leads to the creation of new seeds that grow into new plants. So it all begins in a flower. Flowering plants have several different parts that are important in pollination. Flowers have male parts called stamens that produce a sticky powder called pollen, and flowers also have a female part called the pistil. So on the top of the pistil, which is called the stigma, the pollens often stick there. It is often sticky. So seeds are made at the base of the pistil in the ovule, and to be pollinated, pollen must be moved from stamen to the stigma, and when the pollen from a plant stamen is transferred to the same plant stigma, it is self-pollination, and if it is transferred to a different plant or a different stigma, it is called cross-pollination. So cross-pollination produces stronger plants. The plants must be of the same species. For example, one pollen from a daisy can pollinate another daisy. Pollen from a rose or an apple tree would not work. So in this way, pollination occurs, and plants get pollinated through these agents of pollination. Right? So you will be very amazed to know that some birds such as sunbirds and hummingbirds, which have small narrow beaks, they pollinate flowers, and even mammals such as bats and rodents also pollinate flowers. So how amazing it is, right? So this was all about pollination. Now we will study about fertilization. Yes students, fertilization. Students, as we studied about pollination, so after successful pollination by the agents of pollination, the stigma secretes nutrients if pollen has landed on the correct stigma of the correct plant. Because as we discussed that the plants must be of the same species for making pollination to happen. Like only pollen from a daisy can pollinate another daisy, but pollen from a rose or an apple tree would not work. So, the stigma secretes nutrients if pollen has landed on the correct stigma of the correct plant. So the pollen grains absorb these nutrients and then they start growing. And a thin tube grows out of the pollen grain, because of which this fertilization process takes place. So here you can see the beautiful diagram of a flower in which of a plant in which the fertilization process takes place. Basically, this is a part in which the fertilization takes place. The part of a flower of a plant. So here you can see that this, the middle one, the middle portion, this one is the ovule. And this one here you see is the pollen grain, the beautiful rounded structure, and this is the pollen tube, because of which fertilization is possible. So students, the pollen tube keeps growing till it reaches the ovule inside the ovary, and then it enters it. Then the male gamete is carried inside the pollen tube. So when it is carried inside the pollen tube, what happens? Yes, once the pollen tube reaches the ovule, the male gamete is released and it fuses with the female gamete, means eggs which are present there. And in this way, fertilization process takes place. It takes place, right? So a zygote is finally formed after fertilization takes place. So in this way, after successful pollination, fertilization process starts. So students, remember that after a pollen grain falls on the stigma, this pollen grain, it falls on the stigma, the next step is fertilization. Fertilization occurs when the male gamete present inside the pollen grain combines or unites with the female gamete, which is known as the egg, present in the ovule. And when the pollen grain falls on the stigma of the pistil, it bursts open and grows a pollen tube downwards through the style towards the female gamete in the ovary, because ovules are present in the ovary. So this is ovary. So male gamete moves down the pollen tube. This pollen grain will move down the pollen tube, and the pollen tube enters the ovule in the ovary, and then the tip of the pollen tube bursts open and male gamete comes out of the pollen tube. And in the ovary, the male gamete of the pollen combines with the nucleus of the female gamete or egg present in the ovule to form a fertilized egg, which is also called as zygote. Right? So, and we can say finally that fertilization has taken place. So in this way, fertilization takes place. So that was all about the process of fertilization